After 2 years of legal challenges and political backroom diplomacy, Parliament has finally adopted the government's Rwanda bill, which will transfer UK asylum claimants to be processed in Africa. So when is a jet to Kigali expected to take off? For the time being, the plane's engines will remain silent. Even though the measure has now passed Parliament, it won't actually become law until 12 days after the King grants royal assent, which takes place after the bill has officially passed Parliament. According to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, the first flight is actually expected to occur later than that, in 10 to 12 weeks, or late June or early July. That is later than we wanted, Mr. Sunak acknowledged on Monday, acknowledging that the government will miss its own flight timetable in the spring. But we have always been clear that processing will take time. 52,000 individuals. The only individuals who could be deported to Rwanda are those who have applied for asylum in the UK and entered without permission from another safe nation. That basically refers to individuals who crossed the English Channel in a dinghy. It's important to emphasize that this is before the government determines if they are actually refugees or not. Rwanda is supposed to handle the legal demand for protection. In this pool of 52,000 individuals, it would take more than 3 years to remove them all, even if the Home Office reaches a high of 15,000 forced deportations a year, which was last seen in 2012. That number collapsed after departmental cuts and Brexit, although it has now reached 5,000 a year again. They are currently living in Home Office-funded accommodation and are not allowed to get a job. Their case has not yet been heard to be either removed from the UK or get protection and a new life away from their homeland. The quickest someone could go from being picked up in the English Channel to Rwanda's tropical heat is around 2 weeks. Once officials select a migrant who fits the government's criteria, they are given at least 7 days' notice that they might be put on a flight. After that, officials can tell them they will be on a plane 5 days later. Migrants will appeal. That 7+5 notice period, it's a week longer if someone is not being held in an immigration removal center, means a targeted individual can take advice on whether they want to challenge their transportation to Rwanda. If officials dismiss their pleas, then a migrant can try to go to the courts. Legal challenges. In June 2022, the fight to stop the first flight proceeded all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, where a ruling resulted in the first flight to Rwanda being cancelled minutes before takeoff. Once there, a potential passenger would ask a judge to temporarily block their removal to Rwanda by seeking a court injunction. An injunction would give them time to prepare their case. If several migrants get an injunction at the same time, it could lead to whole flights being grounded. A wider legal challenge to the Rwanda plan is expected, as the new Rwanda legislation instructs judges to ignore a number of human rights safeguards baked into the UK's complex constitution. The European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, informed ministers that the plane could not leave until British judges had been given the opportunity to properly examine the arguments being made against the Rwanda scheme. The UK Supreme Court later ruled unanimously that the Rwanda scheme was unlawful. There are also rumours that unions associated with the immigration system and the public service may take up arms if they determine that it is illegal for an order to violate human rights legislation in order to prepare for the sending of migrants. Lastly, a lawsuit to examine the most contentious aspect of the plan's legality may even be initiated. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling that Rwanda is not currently a safe country, the new statute requires the courts to recognize it as one. Anticipate the legal equivalent of pyrotechnics there, as it presents the issue of government interference with the judiciary's independence. The conflict might then swiftly shift to Europe. The legislation expressly states that, save from extremely rare situations, British courts are not permitted to halt aircraft. Migrants are going to the European Court of Human Rights if the UK's highest courts do not step in to temporarily halt flights. They'll try to claim that the law violates international agreements meant to keep people secure. Strasbourg will only step in if a migrant faces an irreversible risk of damage. Ministers now have the authority to defy the European Convention on Human Rights injunction to keep the aircraft on the runway. The majority of attorneys disagree, arguing that the government's claim that it can disregard the ECHR's interim measures would constitute a violation of international law. But what's the real-world impact? An ECHR provisional ruling not to transfer a man to Uzbekistan was disregarded by France last year. To the humiliation of ministers and officials, the highest court in Paris subsequently ordered the government to bring the man back. There might also be a sting in the tail. It doesn't end there if the first flight departs without a judge getting involved. Judges might ultimately decide that a deported immigrant had a valid case and order the government to bring them back to the UK, which would be the worst-case scenario for ministers. Although it has happened occasionally in the past, it is unlikely to occur before a general election.